welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today we have a very special guest, Penny Arcade, also known as Susana Ventura, a poet, actress, essayist, spoken word, video, and theater maker who creates long-form, text-based performance, a form of experimental theater that investigates the boundaries between traditional theater and performance art based on her poetic practice. Her focus on the creation of community as the goal of her performance and her use of performance as a transformative act marks her as a true original on the international stage. Charismatic and magnetic, she has brought East Village experimental theater to integrity in the international art world. She is the author of 18 full-length plays and hundreds of performance pieces. The daughter of Italian immigrants born in New Britain, Connecticut, a New England factory town, she writes from a first-generation American working-class point of view. She debuted at 18 in John Vaccaro's Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and she was a teenage superstar for Andy Warhol's Factory, featured in the film Women in Revolt. She has contributed to new art forms every decade since 1968, from experimental theater to films with the Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and as Andy Warhol superstar in the 1960s, conceptual art in the 1970s, performance art and spoken word in the 1980s. In 1990, she spearheaded the international neo-burlesque movement with her anti-censorship show, Bitch Dyke Feghag Whore, a blend of erotic dance and feminist humanist politics that left the neo-performance art burlesque movement in its wake. In 1999 was Steve Zehentner, her collaborator of 34 years with whom she has created work since 1992. She co-helmed the Lower East Side Biography Project, a video oral history of downtown New York that broadcasts and streams every Monday at 11 p.m. on Facebook, redefining how oral history is reported. Since 1977, she has maintained a social practice as an artist advocate, and for over 12 years, she has created residencies for artists in her New York loft and has raised thousands of dollars for artists at risk, all without institutional support. Her book, Bad Reputation, a collection of her scripts and ephemera, was published in hardcover by Semiotext in 2010. I welcome Penny Arcade to Savage Minds. Welcome to the show. I have come to know you, Penny, over the years since I moved to Manhattan in 1988, and at many points in my life in New York, I had people say, "Do you know Penny Arcade? Oh, let me introduce you to Penny Arcade." One time, this was in about 2002, when I was back in New York. I had just returned from Italy, and I was in Lucien's restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
And Lucien said, "Oh, let me introduce you to Penny Arcade." You were doing something maybe it was at the Pink Pony, actually. But
Yeah.
long story short, you are one of those people who I came to know very early on in New York because my work and my research at NYU kept me at a distance in a way, but my everyday life in New York and the people I knew, definitely. The Poetry Project, all of the projects going on in the East Village over the years, all the crazy concerts. Like, remember that time Deborah Harry did a free concert in Tompkins Square circa 1991?
Yeah.
It was really crazy time when it was regular stock that you'd be walking down the street and there would be some mega famous superstar and you'd be walking next to them. So it was really a wild time. My life in New York is marked by these surreal images. One thing, while I was investigating a bit of things I didn't know about you, I had read that your father fell ill from a beating he endured at Ellis Island in 1946.
Yeah.
And in 1953, he was committed to Connecticut Valley Hospital in Middleton, Connecticut, where he died 12 years later at the very young age of 50.
Yeah.
So you and your three siblings were raised by your mother, who worked as a seamstress in local sweatshops.
Right.
From there to where you are now is quite a way. Can you give our listeners, just tell us about your background from this tragic experience of your father and your arc from the working class of Connecticut and what ultimately drove you to the art world and to New York City, and more specifically, the East Village, which is, as you know, a genre to itself.
Well, it was all very unplanned. I'm from an immigrant, peasant, working class Italian family on my mother's side. And my father's side, I'm from a northern Italian, Savona to be specific, upper middle class family. My father's father was the captain of the port of Savona, and my parents met when my father was being deported from America, having jumped ship. He was a merchant marine. He jumped ship in Panama and got on a banana boat and swam to Tallahassee, Florida, like a mile, like on a boat. I mean, it's pretty crazy. At any rate, my father was obviously a bipolar adventurer and had been traumatized by the war. His neighborhood in Savona was bombed and 240 odd people were killed, his neighbors, and he became part of the resistance. And I think, he was a young man at that time. Um, um, like, let's see, he would have been, 26 or 25 or 26 when that happened. And I don't know, apparently I carry a lot of his genes. And once he went into the mental hospital, um, we were left with my mother and my grandparents, who were from a small village in Basilicata, which is the Appalachia of Italy. So I grew up in a very kind of primitive environment, having been a little princess till I was 3 while my father lived with us. And to give you an idea of my life, when I was 53 years old and my mother's house had to be sold, my mother died when I was 51. I found a letter scrawled on the back of a painting, of a pen and ink painting of the morning of the crucifixion, a very bleak image of Jesus on the cross and Mary, Mother Mary, Mary Magdalene, and John the Beloved at the foot of the cross. And I had never seen it before, and I'd seen everything in this house because my childhood was filled with mysteries and secrets, and I was always trying to get to the root of everything. And I lived my life like an archaeologist in that house, but I had never seen this particular painting. No doubt my mother had left it out for me to find. Um, and I went to put it on a pile of other stuff that I was piling up in the room that I was conceived in the room that had been my parents' room that became my bedroom. And as I turned it over, I saw there was writing on the back of the painting. And it was a letter from my father to me, October 3rd, 1953, like, I don't know, like, or October 1st, 1953, like 2 days before he got dragged off to this mental hospital. So, there's always been a lot of drama and secrets and mystery connected with my earliest part of my life and with what had occurred way before I was born. And I think that mysteries like this are part of many people's lives. But I was a very intelligent, very intuitive child. And I think the the force of these secrets and mysteries and darkness in my home um, destabilized me, and that there wasn't really anyone to I mean, my mother was working all the time, and my grandparents were very old and very primitive. There wasn't really anybody to, um, catch me. So I kind of started to spin out of control from a very early age. And it was all interior. I wasn't really a belligerent child. I was just somebody who kind of followed some kind of an inner honing device that forced me out of my family. And as I told my sister recently, um, I'm the last person who would have left home. I was very, very attached to my mother, very attached to my family. Um, I'm a very skittish, nervous, generally anxious person, but it's all kind of tapped down and also kind of acts as an engine, but it's still made up of what it's made up of. So it's kind of strange that I'm the one that left, but um, I had to go. And so by the age of 13, I ran away and was stayed away because I was always a good actress. So no one ever knew I was a runaway. And um, I ended up getting put in a Catholic reform school, actually, not even a Catholic reform school, in a monastic reform school. Sisters of the Good Shepherd, who had, it was a French order of contemplative nuns that, through their founder, Rose Virginie Pelletier, later to become Mother Euphrasia, had this reformist attitude towards whores and women of ill repute. So before there were prisons, these nuns started these houses where they took these, young girls, often children, in. And I got sent to one of those by a Jewish woman judge at in Connecticut at the juvenile court because she rightly perceived that I was not a good candidate for Long Lane Farm, that was the actual reformatory, and did me an enormous favor by not sending me to a school for crime. God knows what would have happened to me because I have a tendency to um, excel in whatever situation I'm put in. So if I'd been put in Long Lane Farm, I'm sure I would have probably become, you know, a major thief and murderer if I was in a school for criminals. But I ended up with these nuns who lived a very 17th century monastic life, and they only talked to the girls. And, I like to read, and I was always an intellectual and always philosophical. And so I basically, from the first day I arrived there, I was sort of people recognized. I mean, I threw a fit in the dining room the first night because, well, it's a story I've told a lot of times, but your listeners will like it. I came during dinner time and they put me in the new girl group. And then there were like four groups of girls, like 30, probably 30 girls in each group. And I was talking away, as I'm a big talker. And this nun kept at the front of the room, kept ringing this bell saying, "Silence, silence." And I didn't realize she was talking to me. And nobody told me she was talking to me. And she never spoke to me directly. So I kept talking. And I went to get my your group is called up to get your food, and you have to get your tray and your silverware and your glass of milk, and then you walk past her desk, and she's sitting there, and there's a giant crucifix behind her, and on the desk were three piles of cigarettes, a completely ripped open package of Cools, a completely ripped open package of Marlboros, and a completely ripped open package of Winston's. And I saw the girl in front of me reach out and pick up a cigarette and put it on her tray. And I stepped forward and I looked at the nun and the crucifix, and I looked at the cigarettes, and I reached out to take a cigarette. And the nun rang the bell saying, "Deprived for speaking during silence." And I said, "Fuck you." And she went, "Ding, ding, ding, deprived for the next cigarette." And I said, "I don't give a fucking goddamn fuck." And she went, "Ding, ding, ding, deprived for the next week." And I said, "Fuck you, you asshole fucking motherfucker." And she went, "Ding, ding, ding, deprived for the next 2 weeks." And then I stopped because I thought I might want a cigarette in 2 weeks. And as it turned out, a nun named Mother Mary Mark, who was this totally androgynous, beautiful creature who was in charge of all entertainment and was the major fundraiser for this place, who wore like a purple parka and black PF flyers and dark sunglasses. I mean, before the flying nun, she was the flying nun. And she called me to her office the next day and said, "I caught your act in the dining room last night with Mother Mary Alice. You've got timing. You're funny. I want you to write a play." And that's how I entered into that place. And I wrote the play, and it was a big success. And it was, I mean, and I was like just completely terrified the whole time. And I'd have to say that I've spent my entire life completely terrified. I've never lost my terror, but it's also never stopped me.
That is an amazing story. It sounds like a cross between Mädchen in Uniform and Buñuel's Los Olvidados.
I don't know those things.
It's the first film that Luis Buñuel shot in Mexico after his exile from Spain about a band of kids, one of whom escapes a reform school. Brilliant social analysis. And Mädchen in Uniform, could you not have seen it? It's always playing at the Anthology Film Archives, but it was the Romy Schneider film, lesbians under the tutelage of nuns.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What's it called?
It's called Girls in Uniform. It was a famous film of its time, and then it became, as many, a cult classic. But there are several versions. They remade it. Mädchen in Uniform was first made in 1931, and there was a remake. Wow. The one with Romy Schneider's one I'm thinking of, though. And go on. I just love your story.
So then when I got out of there, which was a kind of a weird lesbian freak out, I fell in love with Mother Mark. And of course it was very chaste. And but the new Mother Superior, I guess, knew about our relationship, which was really a friendship. I mean, I wanted it to be more, of course, but I was also very introverted. So it wasn't like I was, acting on anything. And I was a little girl. I was, 14, 15 years old. So then she, I guess, passed an edict that we couldn't see each other anymore. And that drove me crazy for the injustice of it. So I had a big confrontation with Mother Mark, and she told me, well, she had taken a vow of obedience. And I was like, yeah, well, I haven't. And I couldn't believe she was going to go through with it because it was unfair. We weren't doing anything wrong, But at any rate, that caused me to leave. I mean, my sentence of 2 years was over, but I had been offered to stay and complete my high school in 2 years. Um, and then there was the doctor, the psychiatrist there was he and his wife wanted to pay for my college education, but this whole drama with Mother Mark kind of imploded in the middle of that, and I ended up going home to my factory town and to my very uptight mother. And I think because my mother wasn't really a communicator, um, I was grappling in that town. The only reason why girls disappeared was because they were unwed mothers. So I think there were a lot of rumors about me that I had to deal with. And I had already been the subject of a lot of sexual bullying because apparently I was a very beautiful girl, although I was completely unaware of it. And so everyone in that town said they had sex with me. There were a lot of really jealous girls who, um, a little group of them, a, a vicious little viper's nest of girls who started all these rumors about me. And I just couldn't get out from underneath it. And so that was part of the reason why I ran away. And um, so when I went back, of course, that I was no longer in junior high school. I was in the big high school for 10th grade, but I don't know. I had lost whatever, you know, um, acceleration I had. I was a gifted student and I was an honors student in elementary school. And I was all about going to college, but I kind of lost all of that at the same time as the 60s revolution was starting, 1965, 1966. And in that time, um, just before that, I had met a gay guy named Larry Biscayno, and he and a bunch of queens would come and pick me up late at night when the whole neighborhood was dark and take me to this gay bar in Hartford, Connecticut. So I then discovered the gay world, and that became of pivotal importance to me because I found a community that I could be part of. And I, was always looking for the mythic lesbians, which I was assured existed, but I never saw them because dykes didn't really go to gay bars at that time. I mean, every once in a while you'd see one or two who were usually, a couple. And the one time I tried to sort of reach out to this couple of lesbians, the butch lesbian went berserk, thinking I was trying to hit up her girlfriend, and that that ended very quickly and luckily non-violently. You know, but I was a bisexual child. I mean, I knew I was um, bisexual from a very, very early age, and I was like mostly interiorly oriented towards girls. But in the early '60s, it was very hard to find that. You know, I mean, I think if I was just a lesbian, it would have been different. But I wasn't. I didn't have that all-consuming passion. I was sort of an everything person. And at any rate, long story short, I ended up leaving one night when I was 16 in June of 67 in a carload full of queens to Provincetown, Massachusetts. And they stayed the weekend and then they were going back, and I was like, why go back? I,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought I'd found paradise, I was like, why would you go back? And they were like, well, how are you going to live? And it didn't even occur to me. So I spent the entire summer there, homeless, with no money, usually hungry, but would never tell anybody. And then, kids would come, you know, most, always boys, for a week at a time, and they'd discover me and they'd feed me and sometimes let me sleep in their hotel room. And the rest of the time I slept in doorways, and God knows, I just have no idea how I did it, because um, I would often go into the woods, and for that apparently was before I developed my night terror, because definitely since I was 20, I've had night terror, so I can't really go anywhere that normal people can go to, like be alone at a lake or at the beach, or go take a walk in the forest. I'm like attacked by negative elements, which I think comes from once I left Provincetown, I ended up in the East Village, and it was during just past the Summer of Love in 1967, and um, there were like thousands of runaway kids, but that attracted many, many, many predators and uh, child molesters and rapists. And as a homeless kid in the East Village, I was attacked probably 5 times before I was 18, always by strangers, always very violent. And that combined with LSD probably gave me my my night terror, gave me my emotional holes in my aura, I think somebody once called it.
The Summer of Love. It was a phenomenon that grew out of Haight Ashbury. And
It was a phenomenon in the country. It wasn't, it, I mean, obviously, San Francisco was the place that was the most reported on, and there was a song, come to San Francisco with flowers in your hair. But I went to New York, and the East Village, had a completely similar, demographic to the hate, and then I was discovered after a year on the streets of New York by Jamie Andrews, who I had met in Provincetown, and he saw me in the street and realized I was at risk, and took me in. And then he's the one who took me to the Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and that's how I got into the theater. But like I said, wherever I was put, I would have blossomed. So if I'd been taken in by a group of surgeons, I probably would have been a surgeon, you know.
right, right, right. Interesting way of looking at it, but I understand where you're coming from. So you were in New York, and as I have read, you got involved with the Playhouse of the Ridiculous.
Right?
And when you were 20, you moved to Europe. You spent a
Yep.
decade there. You turned down a role in the London production of Andy Warhol's play
Yeah,
Pork.
but that was earlier. I mean, that was 71.
Right.
I mean, I left, I was going to be in it, and then I left New York with Vaccaro and went to Amsterdam. And then Vaccaro was insane, and I ended up living with this Dutch male hustler named Renee, and um, they went to Paris, and I stayed in
That's right.
Amsterdam. And I stayed for like 8 months in Amsterdam, and then I ended up my sister ended up coming from America. She was 17, and we ended up going to Spain.
That's
And
right. You went to the island of Formentera in Spain's Balearic
right,
Islands. Can
right.
you describe what happened there? Because that's a great story. That's wild.
Going to Spain.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the thing is that it's a Catalan island. Ibiza, Mallorca, Menorca, um, and Formentera. Formentera is the smallest island. What happened was when my sister and I got off the ferry from Barcelona, it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and the very first person I saw was somebody that I knew from Max's Kansas City in New York. And they didn't see me, I saw them. And I was like, oh God, get me out of here. And so we got on the boat to Formentera, which I had heard of Formentera while at Max's. This girl, Sandy Sawyer, who was a girlfriend of a gay guy I knew named Richard Hanneman, came running into Max's and said, Richard says, come to Formentera. And she didn't say what country it was in. And of course, being Italian, Formentera could be anywhere. It could be in Italy, it could be in Spain, who knew where it was. I didn't even realize that I was going to the same Formentera that he had spoken of, you know. And Formentera was, well, we called it the Rock. I mean, it's a very sparsely forested island. It's a very small place. It's about 12 kilometers long. And when we got there, it was they were still living like in the 19th century. The women, wore old costumes with long skirts and heavy little jackets and straw hats, and they all looked exactly the same. They all had exactly the same hairdo, which was parted in the middle, uh, pulled back, and then a long braid down the back. And the thing was, though, that they spoke a dialect of Catalan called Evisenc, which is from Ibiza, and it was very, very, very similar to my Southern Italian dialect, very similar to Neapolitan, because the king of the king of Spain was well was the Prince of Naples. Spain ruled um, southern Italy and Sicily for over 400 years, and so they Neapolitan, like Provençal, they're all like a form of Catalan. And so it was very easy for me to become involved with the paillas, which is what the farmers were called. And I think I just veered to it because it had the familiarity of my childhood. And so, I was part of the expat community there, but I was also equally part of the local farmers, and I loved it very much there. It was a very metaphysical, very lonely, kind of a bleak place, but with beautiful, beautiful. The nature was quite extraordinary, but um, but it was like a lonely place. It wasn't lush in any regard. Very, very, very different from Ibiza. And people who lived in Ibiza, couldn't stand Formentera, and people who lived in Formentera only went to Ibiza to go to the markets. And but I loved Ibiza too, and eventually I lived in Mallorca, in Palma. I lived in Palma de Mallorca for a year. Um, I had started a school in Formentera. I was friends with all these children of expats and drug dealers, and a 4-year-old girl named Afra, who I still know today, um, asked me, she said, Susanna, make us a school. And so I made a school for these children, based on reading the autobiography of Maria Montessori. I had no idea she was an educator, no idea. Like, I mean, I never, to be honest, I've never had an idea about anything I've done. I just like sort of intuitively bump into ideas or values. And if I resonate with them, I absorb them. And so I started the school, and then I did the school for like 2 years. And then I went,
So this was a school basically for the children of drug smugglers?
well, some of them were drug smugglers. They weren't all drug smugglers.
And so this island, as you've described it, is very rustic, and there wasn't much of an infrastructure there developed by Spain in any way.
No, no, no. There was no infrastructure at all. I mean, I lived in a house with a polished dirt floor, very close to the ocean. I mean, that house now rents for like probably $10,000 a week. It's become very chic. Formentera. It's extremely chic. But when I lived there, if you went into the bodega, uh, into the little shops in the village, they had all canned goods, canned milk, like tulipan, like this weird margarine. And then the only thing fresh you could buy would be dried figs and dried almonds and maybe a goat's cheese from one of the farmers, and then dried sardines. I mean, it was really hadn't changed very much in a couple of 100 years. Um, I mean, I guess the canned goods, you know, were, uh, of that century, but it was a very special place, and I loved it very much, and the farmers called me. It was farmers and fishermen, and they called me una filia de la isla. So I was a daughter of the island. They recognized me as as different from the other expats. And then I went to live in Mallorca because I went searching for I threw the I Ching, and it said it furthers one to cross the great water. It furthers one to see the great man. And I was trying to figure out what that meant. And I had a book of Mallorquin fairy tales, that was edited by the poet Robert Graves. Although I didn't realize he was a poet, he was just a man with a big shock of white hair on the back page of a paperback. And I was like, oh, I ended up going to find Robert Graves in Mallorca, in Daya, and I actually found him. And then I, it was a Daya in Mallorca is a very magnetic place, and I was there for like over a month, and then I went to Solier and happened to see this political puppet group, and I was quite enthralled with them, and Pep Gomez, who was the puppeteer, invited me to come and be with them in Palma and join their puppet company. And I did. And I stayed there. I worked with them for the better part of a year. And then I got the idea. I met this guy who told me he knew a girl who drank with sailors and was making like $300 a week, which in 1973 was a lot of money in Spain. And I thought, oh, I'm going to save the puppet theater because we had no money. We're very, very poor. And so I went to drink with sailors and ended up bringing a sailor home in camouflage, Bobby Sparks from Florida. And in the morning, I went to introduce him to Pep and Sarah, who were in their 40s. And I was, 23. And here I am with this kid who's just come back from Vietnam, who's 23 and has never been around artists or art. And I loved, you know, uh, exposing him to this world of art. We lived in this big block through huge apartment on Calle de Los Angeles in Palma, and the what would have been the formal dining room uh, was Pep's studio, where he would make paper mache figures of all the major political figures of the day, and that was the puppet theater that we did. And I brought him in to meet Sarah and Pep, and Pep took one look at his camouflage and went berserk because he was an anarchist and a communist, and he went berserk. And I got Bobby out of there. But when I came back, um, it turned out that I had um, pressed on some kind of um, wound that he had, which I was unaware of, that his mother had been a prostitute in the Barrio Chino in Barcelona. So he had grown up with his mother, um, you know, having men come in and out, with like a sheet across the room. And he'd grown up with this trauma. Um, and he immediately associated it with me and was calling me a whore and went totally crazy. And I used to wear this perfume called Rain by Kiehl, a Kiehl's perfume called Rain. And he started sniffing around my head and saying, you smell like a whore, like a cheap whore, the cheap perfume of a whore. And I'm going, no, it's Kiehl's. It's expensive. And he went nuts and he threw me out. And so I didn't know where to go. So I followed the ship that Bobby Sparks was on to the south of France to Mentone. And, Bobby wasn't having any of that. I guess once he left, his friends had really ragged him for like being involved with a bar girl. And by then I like knew, the woman who did the bars, because they would move them around the Mediterranean, following the ships. Annie Petit was her name. She was from Marseille, and I like kind of drank drank in B bars back to Spain and in Mentone and Nice and Cannes, and then finally came back to Mallorca, only to find that I had been confused with someone who was selling drugs to the USS Forrestal, and the police were after me. And I found out they were looking for me, and I went to talk to them. And this was still during the reign of Franco, and they basically told me that I was either going to go undercover for them in Ibiza, or they were going to send me to prison in Madrid. And I ended up talking them into letting me go to my sister's wedding, because my sister was getting married in Connecticut. And they said, I could go for 2 weeks. And of course, I never came back So then I came back to the States and ended up living at my mother's house, which I hadn't done, all those years. And I met a guy named Bodan who was a Ukrainian refugee, a couple of years older than me, was an artist, very interesting, dark person. And he had land in Maine. And so I went to Maine with him and lived, off the grid in Maine, with no electricity, no running water, all the usual, just like I had in Spain. But this was with snow, add snow. And I did that for let's see, about 3 years. And then he died in a canoeing accident. And at the same time as I had taken over a theater and was running a theater for the town of Pittsfield, Maine. And it was very traumatic. His family blamed me for his death, and I wasn't allowed to go to his funeral. And so right after that, that was 78. I still ran the theater, and then I started coming back to New York. And in 79, I ran into Ellen Stewart, who made a big fuss about seeing me and ended up, um, saying to me, "Oh, what does it mean for theater if Penny Arcade is back in New York?" And within 2 years, she had invited me to reprise a role I had done in 1970 for her 20th anniversary with the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. So I came back in 1981 to do that play and moved back to New York. And then John Vaccaro, who was as insane as he was brilliant, basically used me as a punching bag, emotionally, which he always had, but I never reacted to it. But I had, from reading Anani's Nin, I had decided to go into therapy, and I went into analysis, and I slowly woke up to myself. Well, quickly, I guess. I quickly did. And I confronted him about his treatment of me, and he fired me, which was very traumatic for me. But then it's the reason why I started to make my own work. So there you have, in a nutshell, my life, how I became.
Amazing.
Yeah,
This is even just the beginning because you have reinvented yourself, your art, you've invented
right,
new genre. And in fact, upon your return to New York at the age of 30, you experienced the Reagan administration. So from Europe to your brief stint in New England, and
right,
there you were in New York, the Moral Majority, an American political organization and movement associated with the Christian right and the Republican Party, took aim
right,
at
right.
many of our great artists, from Robert Mapplethorpe, Andrea Serrano, Karen Finley, Holly Hughes, Jim Fleck, Tim Miller. And this got drawn out into a change in how the art world was funded.
Well, that was 1990.
That's true. I'm skipping a bit here because when I wanted to have you on the show, if you recall, like 18, 20 months ago, when there was a brouhaha in New York, which we'll get to in a moment. And what's interesting is that what happened in the 1980s inflected changes upon the art world and the funding of art. In 1991, Helms
Right,
vituperated that the
right,
NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, was financing art that would, quote, this are his words, of course, turn the stomach of any normal person, while he proposed an amendment to the appropriations bill forbidding the use of these grants, of the NEA money, in promoting material that would be deemed as depicting, quote, sexual or excretory activities or organs. I'm sorry, I got to laugh at this guy. In an offensive way. Okay, end quote. So 1991 wrapped up the damage he started in the 1980s. The Senate voted 68 to 28 in favor of the amendment. When you moved back to New York in 1980, he had not yet kicked off. But it's really, I think, important that we look at this era for what it is, because you had many things happening at the same time. 1981, the sad arrival of AIDS, which decimated many of our friends. I'm sure you were going to funerals regularly by the mid 80s, and the art world and the fashion world and the design world, they were hit incredibly. And this was all focused on New York City as well, even the publishing world. And then the art world, of course. You were in New York. You had already made connections and had collaborated with some amazing people, from Andy Warhol to Vaccaro. And then here you are in New York. The world has changed. Men are dropping dead. Gay men, who, as you have just described, became your de facto family in part. What happened to you in the 80s? Because you're experiencing your own, let's say, anagnorisis, this kind of change in your life artistically, in your personal life, and then back to the city.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, you have to go back to the 60s, because I was involved as a teenager with Abby Hoffman and Yippee, and with the Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers, which were an anarchist group that they were called a street gang with analysis. So I was already an anarchist as a teenager. And what happened in the 80s, right? Of course, I was at the center of the AIDS epidemic. I lost over 300 friends of mine. I lost my audience. Like a few years ago, we showed a film that we made of Quentin Crisp at the Museum of Art and Design, and afterwards there's a restaurant called Michael's, and some of us were up there, and a man walked in who was in his 60s then. This happened like around, I would say it was around 2011 or sometime around then. And this guy walked in and he looked a little bit familiar to me. And he went, "Penny Arcade." And I looked at him and I said, "Oh," I said, "I know you." He said, "You don't remember me." He said, "But I was in your earliest audience." And then he turns to the people I was sitting with and he said, "She was the best, but her entire audience died." And it was so shocking for him to hear him say that, because that was something I would say, that my audience died. Because a lot of people would ask me, why did your work, never go into the mainstream? Why did you not become, as famous as, other people, whether it's, Sandra Bernhard, or even, you know, Karen Finley and Holly Hughes, are their names are much more known, at least in academia, than mine is. And it was because my audience died, and my audience was pretty much 99% queer at that time. And the other thing is that, with the entire censorship that happened, I have to tell you, first of all, I never fit in to the not for profit industrial complex. Okay. I was never accepted in that downtown art scene, which is what was happening in the 1980s. Now, me being somebody who, as Richard Hanneman once said, the person I talked about who ended up steering me to Formentera, who was a very good friend of mine, Um, I, at one point when I lived in Formentera, I suddenly became very popular with the expats, and I didn't know why. And it turned out that Richard had told them, they'd already known me for a couple of years, but Richard told them that I had been an Andy Warhol superstar and that I was famous in New York in underground theater. So they had all sort of flocked to me, but then they had dropped me. And I was didn't know any of this. So I was talking to Richard and I said, I don't know what happened. I said, but these people, they kind of put me on a pedestal and then they kicked me off it. And he explained that he had told them, that I had been the star in New York, but then I didn't behave like it. So they kicked me off the pedestal. And I said to Richard, I said, geez, like, why didn't I know? Like, why didn't I know that was happening? And Stephen said, well, Penny, you're very busy. And so that's always been kind of the thing with me. I do a lot of things. I'm involved with a lot of people, and I play a lot of different roles, and I'm involved in a lot of different scenes at the same time. So when I ended up back in New York, um, you know, the first play I did was with Hibiscus. I did Hibiscus's from the Coquettes, his last play, and he was diagnosed with AIDS. This was 1981, and he was diagnosed with AIDS while we were doing the play, and he died at the end of the play, and was the first case of GRID that was called AIDS. He was the first, you know, AIDS, uh, public AIDS victim of this new thing called AIDS. And but I didn't understand. I thought I had come into the same art scene I had left in 1971, and I did not. I had come into this academic, middle class, stick up the ass um, scene, and being working class, being street. I mean, I've never lost a certain element of the years I spent homeless on the street as a teenager. Um, I mean, you know, I was homeless when I was for like 2 months or for like 6 weeks when I was 13, and then I was homeless at 16. I never lost that edge, and um, I'm, I'm a self-educated person. I have the equivalent of a ninth grade reform school education, and um, I have ties to the upper class, the working class, and the underclass. The only place I have no ties is to the middle class. So I never fit in, and also I think someone brought this up to me. Being beautiful didn't help, and being beautiful and not using it didn't help because I was never manipulative with my looks as other people were, you know. Um, not to be unkind, you know, but Karen Finley used her, you know, pretty girl next door looks. Holly Hughes used her looks, you know, and I think that because of this profound rape background that I had, um, really couldn't do that because any sexual attention made me angry and belligerent. And what most people don't know is that the downtown art scene in the 80s and 90s was ruled by heterosexual men. Mark Russell at PS 122, David White at Dance Theater Workshop. I mean, those were the two powerful venues for performance art. And, I clashed with those men. I just had a big problem. I could not use feminine wiles or anything, and also um, I don't network. I like saying I don't even network with people I know. Like, I just don't like that. I don't like any elitism. I despise elitism. And all of the people involved in the art scene, as much as they can espouse, being non elitist, they're all elitist because they all want a place at the table. And it took me a long time to realize it, but many of the people who have had companies were either from very wealthy families or were women who were married to very wealthy men, lawyers, stockbrokers, venture capitalists. And so I was there um, long time ago when I lived in Maine. I was driving on a back road and I found this like little like junk shop. And inside this junk shop, I found, I think it was like 20 copies of Lou Reed's heavy metal machine music. And I don't know if you're familiar with this record, but it's just a dissonant industrial record. There's no songs. It's just a really heavy duty record. But in the liner notes, he said, um, this is music for people who have no music. And I found that very powerful. And I wanted to create theater for people who had no theater. I wanted to represent um, worlds that I had been part of that were invisible to the middle class eye and possibly even to the working class eye. And this made me extremely unpopular with academia and with these arts administrators because um, my work was very confronting of their values and was very subversive. And I wasn't trying to be subversive. I mean, I've been called a provocateur, you know, ever since I started making my work, but I do not seek to be someone who's provoking. I'm not doing it to provoke. The reality is that these people are provoked. They're provoked by any kind of reality. And I've often said this as well, a provocative gesture does not happen in the theater. That's tacky. That's just shock, you know? And many of the people doing work downtown were being provocative, and their shock occurred in the theater. My shock occurred when people went home and couldn't stop thinking about what they had experienced with me. And that is, to me, what a true provocative action is. It's not just surprising somebody in the theater for an hour and a half. It's when the ideas and the values that you're espousing go home with the person and they can't stop thinking about it. And I can't tell you how many letters and emails I've gotten over the past 30 years that start, I really didn't like you when I saw you, but then I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. And then for the past 15 years, the only thing keeping me going is what you said. So, you know, um, I had a very different role. And also, I'm somebody who was completely without institutional support. So the reasons why I was presented at, say, PS 122 for the period of time I was presented, which was 1989 to 2002, um, was because I brought in an audience. I was a cash cow, you know, but they never promoted my career. I never, I think one of the reasons why I became so well known in New York was because I only worked in New York. And because I had a very much a working class work ethic, I worked a lot. And, I was always being criticized for doing too many different shows. People were always saying, oh, you should just do one, you should just do one show. Like in 1990, I wrote four full-length shows, you know, and my work was not trend-based. I was following my own, this same interior uh, honing device that I talked about earlier. I was following that. And once I realized, which I did in 1990, that the problem was that I was working class and I was immersed in a middle class world of people who had no idea what I had experienced in my life. And I sought to put those experiences on stage. Um, First, biographically. In the 80s, all my work was about people I knew, and I would recreate those people on stage. But then in 1990 is when I started writing from my own life because I saw people were doing all this autobiographical stuff that was just lame. It was just like a very lame middle class. I don't know what to even call it. It was just lame. And and that's when I wrote La Miseria, which was my play about growing up as a girl in a Southern Italian working class world. And that play, which, you know, Mark Russell had me do in the downstairs theater, which is this tiny theater. And I had 33 people in that cast, age 8 to 80. And I revealed the homophobia, misogyny, and racism that exists in the working class Italian American world. And people went crazy. I mean, when Mark Russell saw the show the first night, the next day, he said to me, well, Penny, he said, it's so racist. And I said, I don't think showing racism makes it racist. And but he goes, aren't you afraid that, people are going to think you're racist? And I said, no. And then he finally said his famous words, couldn't you give us a taste of the racism? And the next night I did the play and he was in the audience because nobody could believe that play. The play was all over the top with mostly non-actors. And I had written in the cadence of their voices. So I wrote it like you would write a film. And so it was a very, very, very impacting, very powerful show. And I told the audience at the end of the night what Mark had said, including the words, couldn't you give us just a taste of the racism, which made the audience explode into laughter. And I was also the only person in the downtown art scene who didn't have a cookie cutter audience. Like my audience was filled with Black people and Latinos and queers and not the nice, well behaved queers either, you know. I had all kinds of people in my audience because I didn't have this audience that came from the Village Voice or came from the New York Times because my work wasn't reviewed. So my work was fueled, the audiences were fueled by word of mouth. So the audience had a really huge um, uh, investment in bringing other people to see me because people want to share their values, you know? And so I had a very different audience than everyone else. And it was for that reason that I was the cash cow, especially when funding faltered. Because when funding faltered, they needed me to bring in an audience. And that kind of became my role in the downtown art scene. And I never got a grant and I never got reviewed. And that went on till, um, well, Bitch Psych Fag Hag Whore was reviewed in 1992 in the Village Voice. And that was after it had run for like 2 months the first time and then uh, 4 months the second time before it ran off Broadway for a year. Um, but I was always an outsider in that scene. Sarah Schulman has always championed me, and she's always talked about that aspect of me that I was never supported. In her new book about activism, what is her new book called? Can you remember?
It's the fantasy and necessity of solidarity.
Exactly. So, you know, um, Sarah and I share some central beliefs and central values. My central belief is coalition. So she's using the word solidarity, you know, instead of coalition. But in that book, much to my surprise, I went to her book party in Brooklyn and I got the book and I went to get it signed. And she said, "Oh, Penny, you're in here." And I said, "Oh, really?" And she opened the page to where she compared me to, the painter Alice Neal,
Mm.
where she said, like Alice Neal, Penny Arcade has never received institutional support. Um, she's always made, I mean, literally for 30 years, she's always tried to promote me and has always, talked about the fact that I was unfunded and, you know, that, which is, it's an interesting thing, especially, since academia has ruled the art world since at least 1985, if not before. Um, I'm one of the few people who has managed to have an actual career where I bring my work all over the world. Um, and you would think that they would want somebody who actually has earned a living from being an artist to be teaching in the schools,
Hmm.
in the universities. But I'm not. And the people they have teaching are people who, um, you know, appeal to their art theories, and many of whom, you know, like rarely perform. It's I find it really kind of fascinating.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Well, there's a lot of issues behind this that have to do with class. And as you well know, Penny, the art world in New York, just like publishing in New York, is very class oriented. I'll tell you a story. moved to New York January, New Year's Day, 1988. I got a job very quickly at Scholastic there at 730 Broadway, I
Yeah.
believe, or 725. And it was right across from NYU, where I would later be going that year. I was an assistant to the head of marketing of the textbook division at
Hmm.
Scholastic. I ended up doing a lot of other stuff because they found out I could write computer codes. And,
Right.
anyways, I ended up working with other parts of that institution. And some of the assistant editors that I had to liaise with were living. One invited me over for dinner. It was my first social invite in New York. And it was on the corner of 14th and 6th Avenue, Northeast corner, the
Yeah.
Vermeer, as I recall. I'm thinking, I knew she told me, really nice woman, Eliza. She said she was getting paid 17,000 a year. Now, 17,000 a year in 1988 with an entry, a person holding the door for you and another person holding the second door for you doesn't square. So there were a lot of trust fund babies in publishing. I discovered this very quickly. I was just amazed at all these people earning. Some of the assistant editors were making 14, but
Yeah.
living in buildings that were way beyond their means. The art world, similar. Can you talk about this? Because the reason why I brought up the NEA, which the fragmentation of the funding began in the 80s with Jesse Helms, the moral majority, ended in laws in the early 90s and changes institutionally in the early 90s. But what's interesting about this to me is just exactly what you've said. You and other artists have not been funded. And even when artists are funded, we all know artists who get a residency here and there, but they spend their entire career not being funded. So a residency is great, but the fact is that a lot of these artists who have landed academic jobs have gone to, and you mentioned this once in our correspondence, Yale, for instance. So the end result of the NEA funding shifts meant that there were dramatic changes into how artists were funded. While the agency of the NEA was never abolished, it faced severe political scrutiny, constant restrictions, budget cuts, and a change in its grant making policies. Most devastating and significant was the end of individual artist grants. So the NEA entirely eliminated direct grants to individual artists except for literature fellowships. And this was, of course, a direct response to the fact that Mapplethorpe's controversial photos and Serrano's works had been supported through such grants. Then there was a shift to the organizational support and education. It was an agency focused towards directing large parts of the funds to state and local arts councils, arts education programs for children, and grants to large established organizations. And this is where we're heading towards the elitism, because who can afford to have an art gallery in New York City? Who can afford to have an established organization? What does that mean? Established organization, right? And then there was also a shift in focus on access over experimentation. So the new policies prioritized access to the arts and community-based programs, which de-emphasized concerns over avant-garde, experimental, or potentially provocative art. So, of course, people like you were not going to be funded because the agency was looking towards.
No, but Julian, I have to stop you because the reality is that the grants were always elitist. From the beginning, there was no space because in 1985 or 86, I was in communication with the NEA. And a lot of the people who worked at the NEA were fans of mine. They would come to New York and they were fans of mine. And I would talk to them on the phone and they would say to me, well, you need to get the people who are on the funding committees to see your work. And I said, wait a minute, I'm supposed to get them to see my work? Aren't they supposed to go out and see work? So it was already completely flawed from the beginning. Also, the gearing towards academia, the money going for education instead of going for art had already started during Reagan. That had already started. long before Jesse Helms. There was already that kind of um, uh, direction. The other thing is they give the grants to the same people all the time.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing with you, Penny. I just
No, I
think
know
that
you're
things
not.
got so bad in the 80s and they went from bad to worse.
I'm
Yeah,
telling you, it was always bullshit.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
was never not bullshit.
And
Okay.
they do give it to the same people, and they give it also to people who go to certain institutions often,
Of course
right?
they do. It's a reward. And now that's what has happened now is even more disgusting than what had happened before because starting in 1985, they started with emerging arts, which is a completely corrupt idea. And that is that artists need to be in some kind of a hothouse situation in order to develop. And all that it has done, I mean, beginning in 1985, the Jerome Foundation was the first emerging arts funding. I applied for a Jerome Foundation grant, and somebody who was on the panel told me that uh, people had recommended me for the grant, and they were shouted down by other people, also artists, on the panel, saying, Penny Arcade's not an emerging artist. She worked with Andy Warhol. So, why the fact that I worked with Andy Warhol when I was 19 had anything to do with me making my own work when I was 35, I don't know. But this was, my personal experience with it. And now emerging arts has become, so absurd. It's absurd because it doesn't come out of the art world. It comes out of academia, and it comes because parents ed- paying to educate their children to be performance artists, choreographers, spoken word, poets, experimental filmmakers want to be assured that there is a entry level position for their kid like there is in finance or in law. And art is not a profession, it's a vocation, And so now what that has led to, and it's a real degeneration, because what it's led to is that arts administrators now have a cast iron excuse to dump a generation of artists every 8 years because the funding is all geared towards emerging arts. And most of these people will never, ever have a career in art because all they know is to be funded. I mean, in whatever it is, 47 years of me making my own work, in total, in total, I have received $30,000 in grants. There are people who are 25 years old who've already gotten $100,000 in grants and they haven't done anything. You know, they're all they're all presenting their you know, the work they showed, their last year in school. Um it's a real I mean, I've said recently if I was if I was 50, I would go to school, I would go to university, and I would do a study on what arts funding has achieved since 1972 when it was when it was started, because I do not think it has any impact, you know um, on the development of art. Today, arts administrators are developing, it's all about developing their institutions and developing their own careers. If you take a highly achieved performing artist, like someone like me, and then you compare my salary, my yearly salary, with a highly achieved art administrator who's been working for 30 years. One of these people is making $34,000 and it's not the arts administrator, you know? So it's really, and it's gotten just worse and worse and worse because now, with the whole woke agenda, you know, and they always do this, before they were only like funding white people. Now they're only, funding minorities, um, it's like everybody has like a mission statement, you know, to fund non-binary, trans, it doesn't go by at all by the achievement of the artist. There's no interest in developing the careers of artists, which is what we thought these arts institutions were supposed to be doing. We're supporting the development of the careers of artists. They're only supporting the development of their own careers.
2 years ago, when I wanted you to come on the show, this was around the public debate regarding the Radar Festival at the Public Theater.
Yeah.
In mid 2023,
Yeah.
Oscar Eustis, the artistic director at the Public Theater, announced the
Right.
indefinite suspension of the Under the Radar Festival at the public
Right.
for entirely financial reasons, as he stated.
Right.
And at the time we spoke about this, and this is what you wrote me, quote, "The situation for independent artists has deteriorated over the past 35 years as the not-for-profit industrial complex has grown in combination with academia, which spawned the absurd concept of emerging artists, so all funding goes to people who get MFAs from universities." And we know which universities, right?
Right.
Can you
Right.
describe not just that festival, I mean, you can talk about that too, but delve into the problem about this because, like you, I noticed the same thing. I was teaching in the media studies department at the New School, and they
Yeah.
started this master's. And you know about this, but I burst out laughing when I saw it. At first, it was media management, and then they had another department had the arts management. Like I forgot the exact title, but it was something like art management. And I was thinking, talk about putting middlemen in there. So, as you just noted, all this is what Adolf Reed and other Marxists would call the professional managerial class, the PMC. They are taking over the work that you and other artists do. And of course,
No, but you don't understand. It's been taken over already for decades.
yes.
This is the end of it. This is not the beginning of it. And also the thing is that the people who are studying, like, I teach twice a year a class for a casting director named Arnold Mangioli at NYU. And I guess it's an elective class. It's called Preparing for the Profession. And he brings me in because I self-produce, I write, I perform. He, I'm like a catch-all for all the jobs that artists do. Are you still there? Okay, I just heard a noise. Any rate, so the kids, and I've been doing this for 20 years, this class, right? And it's people from all of the different art schools and performing schools at NYU, right? Musical theater, television, film, everything. These kids, the first question they have always asked me is, how do you get a grant? How do you get booked? They never ask about making art, ever. It's always this other thing because they've been, taught that art is a profession, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, the thing is that, when I do this class, Arnold always has like the first question in the class is the kids are supposed to have done some studying on me, and they're supposed to speak about what they know about me. And it's just absurd, because as I say to them, like I'm supposed to ask you this question, but I don't even want to go there because you Googling me as you walk into the class is not you researching me. And then they all look quite bemused, you know. I just did it the other day. Only one person out of like 25 people had actually researched me, and the other ones were all lying, you know. And I told them, you're lying, you know. And I said, don't even open your mouth. I said, because I know you're lying. I said, because the truth of the matter is that if I was Kate Blanchett, you would have broken your neck to come up with the most obscure thing you could find about me in order to impress me. I said, but you see, you think you know who's important. I said, but as an actor, you're a small business owner. Everybody has to be important to you because you don't know who can help you, you know, and who, you know, who can make the difference in your work or your career. And these kids, I mean, they start out hating me for the first hour, and then by the third hour they're weeping and saying, nobody ever tells us the truth, blah 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 blah, you
Yeah.
know. But you know, the thing is that, I mean, it's a pyramid
Yeah.
scheme. You know, these people will never earn a living. Like I say to them, you know, if your uncle isn't Martin Scorsese, you know, you're never going to work ever, you know, because you don't have any, you don't have any guts. You don't have, you don't have any drive, you know. The thing with me that I find interesting now that I'm 75 is I had so much kinetic energy. You know, my drive to express myself was so strong, you know, and my um the great playwright poet Kenneth Bernard, who wrote a lot of the plays that the Playhouse of the Ridiculous did, called me a reformer. And he's right, because I think the world can be better. I think life can be better. I think I can be better. We can be better, you know, and I believe that the role of theater is um, to have us experience what we're either unable or unwilling to experience. Um, but even I'm kind of shocked at this point in my life, um, you know, how unwilling to give in I was. You know, a lot of people who I knew in the 60s, who did theater, like they stopped by like 1979, you know, once they realized there's no money in it, you know, because only a very, very small group of people make money, you know. Um, you know, they, like I said, they fund the same people over and over, and then those people don't continue to make art. They go into academia and get cushy jobs, you know, not naming any names, but pretty much everybody's in academia, you know. Um, but there's very little respect for the real artist, for the working, I should say, the working artist, you know. And the working artist always becomes known after their death, when the gatekeepers are not there anymore, you know. It's I think it's quite a phenomena.
No, you're right. It's interesting how much gatekeeping there is. When I mentioned the 80s and 90s, I agree. I think the art world has had its own history of, even back to Peggy Guggenheim, let's face it, of elitism. Her autobiography, by the way, is one of the best autobiographies out there. And I think, the art world has had its time with the upper classes, such that, like you say, it takes someone dying. Like the artists we know who were not well funded in the 80s were gay men who died of AIDS, because that became its own niche market too, right? Would people have cared about Keith Haring? These are questions that I do ask myself. And then there's a lot of who hobnobs with whom. And I think that this does raise other issues.
But it's always been like that. When I complained to Quentin Crisp in 1994, and I said, uh, you know, uh, you have to know somebody to get ahead, and he said Michelangelo knew a pope. You know,
True.
it's always it's not anything new, but the reality is that the enduring art tends to be made by people who just made art without any support and without any money. And that's why we always hear about them 100 years after they've died, you know?
Yes.
I mean, it's like, there's practically a cottage industry right now in discovering who was left out, which artist was left out before they died, you know? And I mean, they're reaching back into history's midden, you know, to come up with people, especially women, you know, who were writing or making art or whatever they were doing, you know, 100, 200 years ago that we still don't know, you know?
Yeah, well, and plus there are the women whose work was co-opted by men, such as James Joyce's wife, right? I mean, there's a lot of history that has been misrepresented, and we will probably never.
Well, there's that too, but there's also the fact that they choose. I mean, my friend Chris Kraus, for instance. So Chris spent many, many years in complete obscurity. Of course, she was married to Sylvain Lotringer, who was a great intellect. And I mean, I think she had quite, an extensive education for the 20 years she was with him. But she was a very unsuccessful experimental filmmaker. And then, uh, through him, through Semiotext, she became an editor. She had her own imprint at Semiotext Native Agents. And then she wrote I Love Dick, which had a small success, but then was discovered 25 years later. And now she's like the new Joan Didion. And
Yeah, yeah.
and everywhere you turn around, she's being lauded, or Patti Smith, who really is known for what she did in the 70s, you know, and everywhere you turn around, it's like, you know, it's Patty time all the time, There must be other women artists, you know what I mean? But it's the way the media works. The media hijacks our attention and then rents it back to us and basically recycles the same people over and over and over.
These institutions also recycle narratives. When you
Yeah,
mentioned about having to tick non-binary queer to get grants, this was true when I was doing my PhD in New York and wanted to get grants to do my research and to fund my
right,
writing of my dissertation. And I had to make queer appear a lot in my research proposals, and I got the grants. And I have a
right.
problem with this, though, because I'll tell you why. I presume you know Jack and Peter and the Petit
Yeah,
Versailles, and I met them
yeah,
in the queue at the Biennial in Venezia many years ago. This was back in
yeah,
2000 or 2001, I can't remember. But one thing
right.
that has struck me is the way in which queer ate up a lot of what we did in the 80s with gay rights. Somehow now you can't say gay, it's queer. As you know, we've talked about this. There's been a whole blowback between feminists, not all feminists, but a lot, and this gender identity community. And I myself taught at New York University and the New School. I did a lot of work in queer theory. But at the
Yeah.
time when queer was not this doxa, it was not something you had to wear. It was just,
Yeah.
it was used in the same way as the way that African American rappers would use the N word. They sort of
Right.
demystified the badness of the word. And
Right.
by
Right.
using it,
Reclaiming it. Yeah.
exactly. Now, that's what I thought queering meant because in the early 90s, all the books about queering identity were just that. And I'm thinking of Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, even early Judith Butler. And this wasn't a mandate to go out and start saying, you must call me these pronouns, you must see me as I see
Yeah.
myself. And I've
Yeah.
had a huge battle with this demographic because I've written about it, had death and rape threats about it. It's a real problem to me because I was testing out the word queer in the early 90s, but I was like,
Yeah.
am I saying this because I really don't? I mean, I'll be honest here. I don't like the word lesbian. I do not know why. It sounds like a disease. So I started, a lot of American women say, I'm gay. In
Right.
England, that's verboten. You must say lesbian. I'm like, do I have to say it? Can I say Lebanese?
Yeah.
And so, I'm at this point of a battle with this community that is saying, I see this stuff even here in Italy from the gay and lesbian groups on Facebook or on Instagram, and they have all us gals. And it's like, no, those two are 7 foot, not gals. And I get a little annoyed. I can't go on dating sites, for instance, because if you say only women, please, you'll get kicked off. This is what happens, yeah? Uh,
No.
and it's a real mess because now I'm being
Well,
forced to accept the lesbian penis. And it's like,
yeah.
no, thank you.
I know. I mean, it's very depressing, and it's really, really, really depressing. I've stopped talking about it publicly because I'm 75, and I have health problems, and I have a lot of issues going on in my life generally, as you know, with my little great niece and stuff now. But for myself, just with my own health issues over the past 2 years, um, uh, I just couldn't deal with the negativity. And like Steve, my longtime collaborators, said to me, he said, Penny, he goes, you're not you're not achieving anything by having these firestorms, on social media. You know, he said, if you want to do a show about it, let's do a show about it. He goes, but like the social media is poisonous. But there are so few people who you can talk to openly, about these things. Because no, do I think that trans women should compete against women in sports? No, I don't. I don't. Do I think that 13-year-old girls should have their own dressing room, or use their own bathrooms, and don't are nervous about trans people being there? Yeah, I do. Maybe in 20 years we would socially get to the point that a trans teenager, uh, male to female, and a biological girl were the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Um, but we're not there. Like, why is everything shoved down everybody's throat? Like, why do teenage girls have no rights? You know?
Well, it's interesting how it's always being shoved down the throat of the same sex, right? We only hear about these trans men, these women who
Right.
identify as men when they're pregnant. Isn't that the same? And the same thing with these men, who claim to be women. They're the top heads of major corporations.
Well, one of the things that nobody talks about is that a lot of the trans lobby is funded by male to female heterosexuals, people who were cross dressers, because there's no pity or empathy either in the gay world or in the heterosexual world for a cross dresser. And now a lot of those people, I don't want to say are hiding out, but they're sheltered under the word trans woman. you know? And I say, well, that brings mansplaining to a whole new level, you know? And but you can't talk about this stuff. And even people, because I mean, my world was dominated by drag queens and gender outlaws. You know, that's what I grew up with. That's my that's my particular tribe. Those are my people, right? And as I've said many times, I have never experienced gender. I don't experience being a female. I've never had that um, sense of myself. My 23-year-old assistant always says you're non-binary. So I suppose if I was 20, I would identify as non-binary, but I also identify as a biological woman, and I will continue to identify as a biological woman as long as women are under siege, and we are under siege.
Yeah, we're under siege. And I think when it comes time to speaking up about the rights of teen girls, I've interviewed girls on the show who lost scholarships because a 16-year-old boy or 17-year-old boy who identified as beat her out at a track meet. Not just one,
Yeah.
there were several. And it's a recreation. I hate to say it, but it's a new frontier of misogyny and, dare I say, homophobia.
Yes. No, it is. It's homophobic.
I heard this at the cubby hole. Dudes walk in and they're like, well, you haven't tried the right guy. It's the same discourse, just twisted a bit.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's so annoying. And I mean, I went to this event for Marsha P. Johnson. Now, Marsha was a very good friend of mine for 20 years, and Marsha was not trans. I'm sorry, but anybody who knew Marsha wasn't trans. Marsha was a drag queen because it gave her attention. She came from the Jackie Curtis School of Drag, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it was about attention, and so anyways, they had this event in Hoboken where Marsha used to live part-time with Randy Wicker. And I got up and I said this, and I said, Malcolm is being co-opted, and it's a complete drag because these people, it's because Marsha's dead and black that they can do this because, you know, I went on, and it was really funny because Randy Wicker came on after me and he said, everything Penny Arcade says is true. He goes, and I told them, I want them to use my pronouns. He goes, and I insist they use my pronouns. And my pronouns are it and that. And people got very upset because here's this over 80-year-old, saying this stuff. And I mean, there's no humor and it's so authoritarian. But what happened was this person got up afterwards and was a large female black person, um, with a hairdo and dressed in feminine clothes, and started this story. And the story went like this. Well, I was very worried. I was going to the doctors for my pap smear, and I was very worried that I was going to be misgendered because it happened to me before. And even the other night at a queer bar, somebody said, what's your problem? You have a pussy. Now I'm confused because the person is presenting as trans, right? So then they tell their story about how they went to the gynecologist with their mask that had their pronouns on it, they and them. And yet the nurse who showed them into the treatment room called them her. And this person then proceeded to say, my vagina is not a female vagina. It is a trans vagina. My uterus is not a female uterus. It's a trans uterus. And like people were like cracking up, she was totally serious, But it was just like you're just there and you're just like, you know, you are making it really hard for people who are actually trans, you know. And there are people who are trans, And, of course, what you were saying, and I've said this forever. In 2009, I did Bitch Dyke Fag Hag Whore in San Francisco. And in Bitch Dyke Fag Hag Whore, there's a monologue about being bisexual in a lesbian world. And I say, but a lot of lesbians don't like bisexual women. They think there's something wrong with us. A lot of lesbians think that bisexual women are just not trying hard enough. They think if we just tried a little harder, we would be lesbians. I said, but now nobody wants to be a lesbian. They all want to be boys. They spell it BOI. I spell it HOMOPHOBIA. Well, people went nuts. And of course, with me, for somebody who's as smart as me and savvy as me and observant as me and intuitive as me, I will often put my finger in the wound. So there was at that time in 2009 a huge rift between the lesbian and the new trans world, and the trans men got very upset with me. Turned out all my girl dancers all had trans boyfriends. And but the lesbians who in the 70s and 80s hated my work and are now my biggest fans because that changed too, you know. Um, Lesbians used to be super narrow-minded, and that's changed. And the lesbians were all crying. Thank you for saying it. Nobody will talk about this, And I think it's such a scary element that they're trying to get rid of homosexuality and nobody will cop to it, you know. And so many of the people who you think of as our, gay avengers are either silenced or have drunk the Kool-Aid.